Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates. In our weekly series of mains assignment question from the Daily News Simplified videos, for this particular week, you have a question related to the Production Linked Incentive Scheme. The question here is, the Production Linked Incentive Scheme introduced by the Union Cabinet for the different sectors can enhance the India's manufacturing capabilities and improve exports. Elaborate. This particular question has been asked for 15 marks and you are required to write the answer within 250 words. Now, before writing the answer to this particular question, I suggest you to go through the DNS dated 18th February 2021, in which we have covered the production linked incentive scheme in much greater detail. Those of you who would be able to submit your answers by the end of Saturday, your answers will be evaluated by the Rouse IAS faculties and teachers. All the best. The first article in today's DNS appears from page number 6. The article is titled as Strengthening the Process of Choosing the Police Chief. This article shall be important mainly with respect to Indian polity and governance. As far as this article's importance for the UPSC examination is concerned, from the perspective of prelims, you should basically understand the procedure for the appointment of the Director General of Police. And as far as the mains examination is concerned, you should understand about the problems and constraints faced by police forces in India and the recommendations given by various committees in order to bring about the police reforms. Further, based upon a video discussion, a mains question for your practice here could be: discuss various constraints and challenges faced by police forces in India. Also suggest some measures in order to ensure the operational independence and autonomy for the police. So this particular article basically discusses as to how various state governments have not followed the norms laid down for the appointment and the removal of the Director General of Police. See, the Director General of Police is considered to be the most important officers under the state government. The Director General of Police, he or she heads the police force. He or she acts as a link between the elected government and the police forces. They provide for the leadership and the motivation, which in turn ensures the overall morale of the police force in a country. And moreover, it is being said that the overall operational autonomy of the DGP would in turn promote the operational autonomy of the police forces. In other words, if the office of DGP is independent and autonomous, obviously it would mean that there is no political interference in the functioning of the office of DGP. This in turn will provide the necessary operational autonomy to even the police forces as well. Hence, there is a need to ensure independence and autonomy to the DGP so that he is able to act in a non-partisan and unbiased manner without any kind of political interference. See, a number of committees have given their recommendations as to how should we strengthen the office of DGP. These include the National Police Commission, the Reboro Committee, Padmanabhaiah Committee, the Supreme Court directions in Prakash Singh case, and so on. So, presently there are a number of norms which have been laid down with respect to how the DGP has to be appointed, the minimum tenure of DGP, and his removal. However, this particular article highlights that these norms have been violated in most of the state governments, which in turn has led to lack of independence and autonomy for the office of DGP. So let us first understand as to what are the present norms which are required to be followed as per the Supreme Court directives, as well as various other police commissions such as the National Police Commission, the Padmanabhaiah Committee, Reboro Committee, etc. with respect to appointment of DGP, and how these norms have been violated. See, presently before the appointment of the DGP, suitable candidates need to be shortlisted by the UPSC. So usually UPSC will forward the names of 2 to 3 suitable candidates to the respective state governments, and out of those 2 to 3 candidates, the state government can choose any one to go on to become the Director General of Police. However, most of the state governments have not provided for the shortlisting of candidates by the UPSC, which means the state governments on their own, they are shortlisting the candidates, and on their own they are choosing a concerned person as DGP. Secondly, in order to ensure that the DGP of a state is appointed through an independent oversight mechanism and not solely by the government, the Supreme Court directive as well as various police committees have provided for the State Security Commission. See, the nomenclature given by different committees may actually differ, but on a broad level, the State Security Commission's role would be to appoint the Director General of Police. The State Security Commission ideally should include the representatives from the government, who could be the Home Minister, the Chief Secretary of a state. It should also include the leader of opposition of a state, some of the independent members from outside the government. So ideally there should be a broad-based representation of the members in order to choose a person to become the DGP. However, this particular article highlights that even though most of the state governments have set up the State Security Commission, but the problem here is in most of the states, the State Security Commission has come to be dominated by the government representatives. In other words, the state governments have not given due representation to the leader of opposition or the independent members. So it's like saying that the state governments on their own, they are choosing the DGP. Apart from that, as per the norms laid down, the person to be appointed as a DGP, he or she should be appointed on a well-defined criteria. This should be a multi-criteria which can also include the seniority, merit. One should also look at his track record of a police officer. One should also look at whether he has an attributes of the civil servant. For example, we need to look at his attributes such as whether he has displayed political neutrality, impartiality, honesty, highest level of integrity, and so on during his tenure as a police officer. But once again, these criteria are normally not taken into account by the respective state governments, and most of the time the appointment is done based upon the political considerations. As far as tenure is concerned, usually once a person is selected as a DGP, he or she must be able to serve for a minimum tenure of 3 years. But once again, it has been seen that in most of the cases, the person appointed as DGP is removed even before the end of their tenure. This in turn not only lead to the demoralization of a person who was appointed as DGP, but it also leads to the demoralization of the entire police force. And lastly, according to current norms, if a person is required to be removed before the end of his tenure, ideally, the state government should take the prior approval of the State Security Commission. But once again, this approval is not taken by the respective state government, and most of the time, the DGP of a state is removed at the discretion of the respective state governments. So this particular article basically highlights that even though a number of committees have given a number of recommendations in order to ensure the independence and autonomy of the DGP, these recommendations have not been followed by the respective state governments. Accordingly, we need to strengthen the procedure for the appointment of the DGP in order to ensure the overall independence and autonomy of the police forces. Apart from that, in our DNS dated 17th of Jan 2021, I have discussed in detail about the various problems with respect to functioning of the police. I had also discussed as to how the police of future should be different from police of today. Also, I discussed as to what are the various recommendations of various committees with respect to bringing about the police reforms. So what I would do here is, I would attach the previous DNS video for your revision. After going through this particular DNS video, you should be in a position to write an answer to this particular main space question for the practice. if you look at the role of the police force before India's independence, the police force was an agent of the colonial rulers. It was considered to an oppressive force which was used to suppress the will of the Indian citizens. After the India's independence, when the Indian constitution was formulated, public order as a subject was placed under the state list. Accordingly, all the states have adopted their own police force. The central government also maintains its own police force in order to assist the state governments in various policing functions. Most of the state government have now modeled their police forces along the lines of the Indian Police Act 1861. So, if you look at the police force presently in case of India, it is considered to be an agency of the democratically elected government, unlike the agent of a colonial ruler. It operates within the framework of law which has been passed by the respective state government. So, the basic role of the police force today is to uphold and enforce the laws, investigate crimes, and ensure the safety of the people. But presently, there are a number of problems with the functioning of the police. Even today, the functioning of the police is governed by the outdated Indian Police Act 1861, which is considered to be a British era law. The police force does not enjoy sufficient amount of functional autonomy. Normally, there is huge amount of political interference in the functioning of the police forces. The police officers are required to take direct orders from the elected officials. This, in a way, leads to politicization of the police force. Apart from that, normally the police forces are transferred or promoted based upon the will of the elected officials. So there is no professionalism with respect to how the police force is managed, particularly with respect to transfer, posting, etc. So over a period of time, the police officers develop a close bonding with the elected officials, and this in turn further aggravates the politicization of the police force. So this lack of security of tenure in turn hurts the professionalism that is required to govern the police force. The police force has been invested with the necessary power to use the force. However, this force has to be used for certain legitimate purpose. Unfortunately, this power vested with the police has been misused. This is evident in the extrajudicial killings, custodial torture, rapes, etc. So, in a way, there is poor accountability of the police. Further, there is lack of professionalism with respect to investigation of various crimes. And lastly, if you look at the police force in case of India, it is considered to be overburdened. This is primarily on the account of the fact that there are huge amount of vacancies in the police forces. Most of the state governments spend less than 3% of their budget on maintenance of the police forces. So there is a need to address all of these problems associated with the functioning of the police. The police of the future, it should be more oriented towards serving the needs of the citizens. It should be completely autonomous with an independent legal framework. It should be efficient, professional, people friendly, and should be able to uphold the rule of law with professional integrity. In the past, a number of measures have been undertaken by the government of India with respect to appointment of various committees in order to bring about the reforms in the functioning of the police. It started way back in 1977 with the appointment of the National Police Commission, Ribeiro Committee in 1998, Padmanabhaiah Committee in 2000, Malimat Committee, then the Supreme Court directions in the Prakash Singh versus Union of India case. This was in the year 2006. Further, the Second Administrative Reforms Commission has given a number of recommendations as to how the functioning of the police can be efficiently improved. Accordingly, from the perspective, the UPSC examination will understand as to what kind of reforms have to be brought about with respect to functioning of the police. Broadly, we will take into account the recommendations of all of these committees, including the recommendations given by the second ARC. The first reform is related to the setting up of the Police Performance and Accountability Commission. Now, this is basically a recommendation given by the Second Administrative Reforms Commission in order to ensure that the state government does not unnecessarily interfere in the functioning of the police. Similar to PPAC, the Supreme Court had given a direction to a state government to set up the State Security Commission. So the difference is only in the nomenclature. According to second ARC, it should be named as PPAC, but according to Supreme Court, it should be named as the State Security Commission. But ultimately, the objective is to prevent unwarranted influence of the state government in functioning of the police. This particular commission would be a high-level panel headed by the State Home Minister. It would also comprise of the state-level DGP, the Chief Secretary of the concerned state, the leader of opposition in the Legislative Assembly, plus 5 eminent members from outside the government. The basic role of the PPAC would be to lay down the broad policies for the functioning of the police, evaluate the performance of the police on an annual level. So the idea here is the state government should not be involved in the micromanagement of the police. Instead, that role should be taken up by a high-level expert panel of PPAC. The second recommendation is related to the setting up of the Police Establishment Board. There is huge amount of political interference in transfer, posting and promotion of various police officers. Hence, in order to reduce this political interference and ensure professional management of the police forces, there is a need to set up Police Establishment Board. This will be a high-level panel headed by the Chief Secretary of the concerned state, and it would also include the DGP as well as the Home Secretary of the concerned state. The next recommendation is to set up the Police Complaints Authority, whose main role would be to inquire into allegations of corruption as well as misuse of power by the police. The next recommendation is related to the appointment of the DGP. Now, according to second ARC, the Police Performance and Accountability Commission, it should prepare a panel of 3 names to be considered for the appointment of DGP. These 3 names should basically include the names of the 3 senior-most officers. Once this panel of 3 names is prepared, it has to be forwarded to the concerned state government, and ultimately the state government would have to choose between these 3 persons to be appointed as a DGP. Once a person is appointed as a DGP, he or she must have a security of tenure of minimum 3 years. If the state government wants to remove the DGP before the end of his tenure, then compulsorily approval has to be taken from the Police Performance and Accountability Commission. The next reform is related to separation of investigation and the law and order functions. See, if we look at the nature of skill set required for carrying out law and order functions and the nature of skill set required for carrying out investigation, the skill sets which are required for carrying out these 2 functions are completely different. However, in case of India, it is normally seen that a single police officer not only carries out the law and order functions, but he also carries out the investigation related functions. So this not only leads to an overburdening on the police, but this also leads to the lapses in the investigation. Moreover, since a police who is involved in law and order function is also carrying out the investigation, it in turn enhances scope for political interference in carrying out the investigation. So accordingly, the second Administrative Reforms Commission has highlighted that there is a need to separate these 2 wings of the police. We need to have a separate wing of police dealing with investigation and a separate wing of police dealing with the law and order functions. The next reform is related to improving the police population ratio. According to second ARC, the police population ratio in case of India is 1:694. That means for approximately every 700 people in case of India, we have only 1 policeman. This ratio in case of developed economies is much better. Accordingly, we would have to improve the police population ratio, reduce the number of vacancies, and thus reduce the burden on the police personnel. Apart from that, 87% of the police personnel are basically constables. These constables have limited avenues for promotion. The maximum rank which a constable can retire as is a head constable. So they do have limited avenues for being promoted as a station house officer. So since they have limited avenues for promotion, obviously the level of motivation and morale among the lower level or the cutting edge functionaries would obviously be lower. Hence, going forward, in order to improve the morale and motivation of the constables, we would have to upgrade their skill set and also provide for the avenues for their promotion. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. The next article appears on page number 14 and is titled as Farm Exports Rise by 16.9% in April to Feb 2021. Before discussing various facets of this particular article, let us first understand as to why this article becomes important from the perspective of the UPSC examination. As you all must be aware, India has made rapid strides with respect to the food grain production. The annual production of food grains has increased to more than 280 million tons. India is also the second largest producer of fruits and vegetables. However, in spite of the fact that India is one of the largest producers of the agricultural commodities, India's share in the world's export of agricultural commodities is hardly at 2%, and India is placed at ninth rank in terms of export of the agricultural commodities. This clearly shows that India has failed to leverage the agricultural sector in order to boost its exports. If you are able to boost our agricultural exports, it will not only benefit us as a country, but it will also benefit the farmers. So, in a way, by doubling our exports, we would be in a position to double the income levels of the farmers. Accordingly, this particular aspect of agricultural exports become quite important from the perspective of Indian economy. So in the prelims, one should be aware about the trends in agricultural exports, particularly with respect to top import and export of agricultural commodities. As you can see in prelims 2019, there was a question as to which agricultural commodity accounts for the highest imports into India. So similarly, one should be aware as to which agricultural commodity accounts for the highest export from India. Some of the salient features of the agricultural export policy 2018. As far as the mains examination is concerned, repeatedly in UPSC mains, the highest weightage has been given to the agriculture sector. So in particular, from this particular topic, one should be aware about the constraints and challenges in boosting the agricultural exports and what strategies need to be adopted. At the end of our discussion, you should be in a position to attempt these three practice-based questions for the prelims. As far as the mains practice question is concerned, the question here could be, despite being one of the largest producers of the agricultural commodities, the agricultural export has not been a strong point both at the macroeconomic, that is at the national level, as well as microeconomic, that is at the farmers levels in India. Discuss various constraints and bottlenecks in boosting the agricultural exports from India. Hence, keeping in mind the requirement of the UPSC examination, both from the perspective of prelims and mains examination, we will be covering all these aspects related to the agricultural exports from India, starting with why should we boost the agricultural exports. See, first and foremost, in recent years, there has been increase in the production of various agricultural commodities such as rice, wheat, etc. This increase in the production has in turn led to decrease in their prices. So overall, the income levels earned by the farmers has got reduced simply because of the lower prices prevailing in the domestic market. So if you provide opportunities to the farmers to export the agricultural commodities, the farmers would be able to earn higher prices, and this in turn would lead to increase in their income levels. So in a way, agricultural exports can emerge as a tool to double the income levels of the farmers in India. Secondly, presently there is huge demand for the Indian agricultural commodities in our export markets. So in a way, we are not being able to cater to the increased demand. So by boosting the agricultural exports, we would be able to cater to the increased demand. And last and most important is, in order to boost our manufacturing sector, the Indian government has called for Make in India. Similar to Make in India, we would have to focus on Bake in India. Bake in India here means we would have to focus upon the value addition of the agricultural commodities so that these value added agricultural commodities can in turn be exported to the export destinations, leading to a increase in the income levels. So these are some of the reasons as to why we should boost the agricultural exports from the Indian economy. But if you look at the present status, as highlighted before, even though India is one of the largest producers of the food grains, India has a lower share in the world export of the agricultural commodities. India accounts for only 2% of the share and it is placed at ninth rank. Secondly, if you look at our export basket is not well diversified. In fact, our export basket has come to be dominated by only two set of agricultural commodities. These two being marine products and basmati rice. And third and most important problem here is the amount of value addition. Most of the agricultural commodities which we exported to other countries, we do not carry out substantial amount of value addition, because of which the amount of revenue which we are earning is also lower. So these are some of the present constraints or the present status of the agricultural exports. Hence, in order to address these problems, the government of India has come up with the Agricultural Export Policy 2018. This basically gives an impetus to Bake in India on the lines of Make in India. First and foremost, it seeks to double India's export of agricultural commodities, which presently stands at $30 billion to $60 billion by the end of 2025. Secondly, it seeks to double India's share in the world agricultural exports. And thirdly, it seeks to set up the Agri Startup Fund, which in turn would provide the necessary funding to the agricultural entrepreneurs to boost the export of the agricultural commodities. So India has undoubtedly come up with a grand vision to double its export of agricultural commodities. However, it is being said that Indian agriculture has got itself into a kind of vicious cycle, which in turn has led to decrease in its exports. This vicious cycle has been highlighted by the Committee on Doubling of Farmers' Income, headed by Mr. Ashok Dalwai. So, as you can see in this particular vicious cycle, most of the agricultural land in case of India has come to be fragmented. The small and marginal farmers owning less than 2 hectares of agricultural land account for 83% of the farmers, and these farmers together own more than 40% of the agricultural land. So since the land holdings in India are quite smaller, the yields are quite poor and the marketable surplus as such is quite lower. And if marketable surplus is lower, we need to aggregate this marketable surplus by having necessary market linkages. So let's say in a village there are 50 small and marginal farmers. These 50 small and marginal farmers should come together and aggregate their agricultural produce. By doing that, we would be able to bring about higher economies of scale. Moreover, these small and marginal farmers would have higher bargaining power. But this is precisely not happening in case of India. This level of aggregation is not happening. Apart from that, I hope you must be aware that so far the APMC regime in India was highly restrictive, wherein the farmers were not allowed to sell their agriculture produce directly to the exporters. The farmers had to compulsorily sell their agricultural produce only within the APMCs. So this was an unnecessary constraint on the exporters, which in turn led to poor market linkages. Moreover, the logistic costs in case of India, particularly in terms of storage, warehousing, transportation, is quite poor. For example, the absence of cold chain infrastructure in India is leading to post-harvest losses of almost 20 to 25% of perishable commodities. The total value of these perishable commodities which is getting lost on an annual basis is as high as around 48,000 crores. So these are some of the constraints which we are facing within our own domestic market. But once we export our agriculture commodities to other countries, in other countries also we are facing some kind of discrimination. This discrimination which our agriculture commodities are facing is predominantly in the form of high tariff and non-tariff barriers. So if other countries impose higher customs duty on the agriculture commodities which they import from India, automatically our agriculture commodities will become costlier in the foreign market, and this will in turn lead to the lower demand. So as you can see, the Indian agriculture has got itself into a kind of vicious cycle, which in turn has led to decrease in its overall exports. Now, these constraints and challenges that we are facing in boosting our agricultural exports can broadly be categorized into two types, that is, supply side constraints and the demand side constraints. Supply side constraints would mean as to what constraints which we are facing within our own domestic economy in boosting our agricultural exports. On the other hand, demand side constraints would mean as to what constraints our agricultural commodities are facing once they enter into the foreign markets. So with respect to supply side constraints, first and foremost, there is lack of emphasis on market intelligence. Now, for example, if you look at China, China has emerged as one of the largest exporter of merchandise goods. Now, one of the reasons as to why China has emerged as one of the largest exporter of merchandise goods is because China predominantly focus upon more of market intelligence. Market intelligence here means China basically knows as to which country requires which commodity or goods, and more importantly, at what point of the year does the demand for such a commodity increases. So this is a market intelligence which China has, and China uses that market intelligence in order to boost its exports. Now, for example, you must have seen typically during the Diwali season, the Indian domestic market comes to be flooded with Chinese diyas, lamps, lights, etc. The question is, how is China able to export these diyas, lamps to India? This is precisely because China has invested on market intelligence. China knows that during the Diwali time, the demand for lamps, lights, etc. is higher. So this market intelligence China is using in order to boost its exports to countries such as India. Similarly, China also knows that there is huge demand for the idols of Indian gods and goddesses in the domestic market. That is why China, through its market intelligence, has started focusing on manufacturing of the idols of Indian gods and goddesses, and the same, once manufactured in China, are exported to India. As far as India is concerned, India has not given due amount of emphasis to market intelligence. Now, let me give you an example here. In case of India, there is very high demand for the Alfonso mangoes. This is because the Alfonso mangoes are quite sweeter. Now, India believes that within India, there is a higher demand for the Alfonso mangoes simply because they are sweeter, and hence we expect that there would be a higher demand for the Alfonso mangoes even in the overseas market. But the problem here is in some of the overseas markets such as European Union, there is lower demand for the Alfonso mangoes because of their high sweetness. So first and foremost, what we need to realize is unless we do not have the necessary market intelligence, we would not be able to boost the export of the agricultural commodities. The second biggest problem is with respect to lack of stable and reliable export policy. See, most of the time our focus has been more about ensuring adequate amount of supply of the agricultural commodities within the domestic market. Our focus has not been on export of the agricultural commodities to the other countries. So that is why we have not been able to boost our exports. So predominantly, we would have to balance the need to ensure adequate amount of availability of the agricultural commodities with the need to boost the agricultural exports. Thirdly, a large number of states in India as well as districts have a large number of agricultural commodities with huge amount of export potential. But the problem here is these state governments have not given due amount of emphasis on identifying of these agricultural commodities which then can be exported to the other countries. The next one, as I said, is poor aggregation of marketable surplus. Next is training and skill development. So when we export the agricultural commodities to other countries, these agricultural commodities would have to fulfill certain norms and regulations with respect to the pesticide residue limit, with respect to the amount of fertilizers which we are using, and so on. So unless the farmers are trained with respect to the usage of the pesticides, insecticides, etc., we would not be able to boost the agricultural exports. Next one, as I discussed, is fragmented and restrictive APMC regime, where the farmers are not allowed to sell the agricultural commodities directly to the exporters. However, this has been rectified through the passage of the recently passed Farm Acts. So once we start implementing these three Farm Acts, we should be in a position to boost our export of agricultural commodities. Next is poor infrastructure and logistics, which I have already discussed. Next is lack of coordination. So we do have multiple government agencies and departments involved in export of agricultural commodities. So we do not have proper coordination mechanism between these multiple government agencies and departments at the highest level. The next one is with respect to demand side constraints. As I said, the first demand side constraint is with respect to high import duties on the Indian agricultural commodities once they enter the foreign countries. Second, countries such as US, European Union, etc. have imposed ban on import on number of Indian agricultural commodities such as Alfonso mangoes, honey, etc. on account of violation of sanitary and phytosanitary measures. As you know, sanitary and phytosanitary measure is an agreement under World Trade Organization. So under this particular agreement, a importing country can ban the import of agricultural commodities if they believe that the import of agricultural commodities can lead to harmful impact on human health, animal health, or the plant health. So countries such as US, European Union had imposed ban on the import of Alfonso mangoes, Dabur honey in the recent past. This was done on the premise that the Alfonso mango and Dabur honey had a high insecticide and pesticide residue. So they are applying this WTO agreement indiscriminately, which in turn is leading to lower exports from India. And lastly, as you must be aware, the Indian government has signed free trade agreements with large number of countries such as ASEAN, Japan, South Korea, etc. Unfortunately, after signing of these free trade agreements, the import of agricultural commodities from these countries into India has actually increased, leading to an adverse impact on our Indian agriculture. So these are some of the constraints and challenges both in terms of supply side as well as demand side. So if you have understood as to what are the constraints and challenges, I'm pretty sure that you would be in a position to identify as to what strategies can be adopted in order to boost the export of the agricultural commodities from India. In that case, please do let us know in the comment section as to what strategies need to be adopted in order to boost the export of the agricultural commodities. See, as far as these three prelims based questions for the practice is concerned, I would want you to solve these questions on your own and respond in the comment section with the correct answer. Apart from that, please do also write the answer to this particular mains based question for the practice. For your convenience, I have incorporated the suggested answer structure in the PDF. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 14 and is titled as Exporters Fret Over the Delay in the Rebate Rates. This article shall be important mainly with respect to prelims under the subsection of government schemes and policies. See, earlier the government of India used to implement a scheme known as the Merchandise Export from India scheme in order to boost exports from India. Under this particular scheme, the exporters were provided benefits in the form of the duty credit scrip, which in turn could be used by the exporters to pay the custom duty on the imports, or these duty credit scrips could have been sold to the other exporters as well. However, countries such as USA had challenged the merchandise export from India scheme on the grounds that this particular scheme violated the WTO agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. Accordingly, the WTO dispute panel asked India to do away with this particular scheme and come up with a new scheme which is in compliance with the WTO agreement. Accordingly, the government on Jan 1st, 2020 decided to replace the merchandise export from India scheme with the remission of duties and taxes on the export product scheme. As you can see, both merchandise export from India scheme as well as the newly launched scheme have already been discussed by me in the economic survey video. In this particular video, I basically discuss as to how the new scheme is different from the earlier merchandise export from India scheme. The idea behind the newly launched scheme is to provide for the refund of duties and taxes which have not been subsumed under the GST to the exporters. So the idea is to provide for the zero rating of the exports. So if anyone has not gone through the economic survey video, I suggest you to go through this particular economic survey video in order to understand the working mechanism of the remission of duties or taxes on the export product. So what we would do here is we'll try to understand as to what this particular article is highlighting with respect to the newly launched scheme, and we'll also tabulate the differences between these two schemes. First and foremost, both these schemes seeks to provide incentive to the exporters. However, under the earlier scheme, the incentive was provided based upon the export of goods. So whenever the exporters exported the goods, a certain percentage of the value of exports was given to the exporters in the form of duty credit scrip, which in turn can be used by them for the payment of customs duty. The incentive which was made available to the exporters was almost around 2 to 5% of the value of exports, and this usually dependent upon the product. So as I said, the WTO dispute panel found this particular export incentive scheme to be against the provision of the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. That is why the government has come up with this new scheme. Under this particular new scheme, the government is providing for refund of various embedded taxes and duties. Basically, the embedded taxes and duties would mean those taxes and duties which are not being subsumed under the GST, because of which the exporters or the manufacturers cannot claim the input tax credit. So these taxes would get added up to the value of the exported products. Hence, under this particular scheme, we are providing for a refund of these embedded taxes and duties. Some of these embedded taxes and duties include electricity duty, mandi tax, clean energy cess, and so on. The government believes that the newly launched scheme would be compliant with the WTO agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. As far as the amount of incentives is concerned, please do understand here that here the incentives are once again declared in terms of the value of the product. So here what is being done is we try to identify as to in each of the sectors, such as say textile sector, electronic sector, and so on, what is the extent of embedded taxes and duties. Now, for example, in the textile sector, the percentage of embedded taxes and duties in the textiles and garments could be say around 10%. In the electronics industry, the percentage of embedded taxes and duties in the value of the final electronic product could be say around 15%. So now what we would do here is, when we issue the duty credit scrip to a textile industry, we would issue a duty credit scrip which will be equal to 10% of the value of the exported product. So if a particular industry is exporting a textile product worth say rupees 100, then such an industry would be issued with a duty credit scrip of rupees 10. Similarly, let's say there is an electronic industry Now, in the electronic sector, the percentage of embedded taxes and duties could be around say 15%. So this case, a particular electronic industry will be issued with a duty credit slip of 15% of the value of the electronic commodity. Now, in order to understand as to what is the percentage of the embedded taxes and duties in various sectors of the economy, the government had appointed a committee under the leadership of G.K. Pillai Committee. The G.K. Pillai Committee was required to go into and find out as to what is the percentage of embedded taxes and duties in each of the sector of the economy, and accordingly give the recommendations to the government as to what should be the refund rates or for the different sectors in the economy. Now, G.K. Pillai Committee has already given its recommendations. However, the government is still yet to act on this committee's recommendations. That is why the government has so far not notified as to what would be the refund rates. So particularly the exporters as of now are still unsure as to what percentage of the value of their exports would be refunded back to them. So there is lack of clarity with respect to the implementation of the newly launched scheme. So this in turn is creating nervousness among the exporters. So the government needs to act upon the recommendations given by the G.K. Pillai Committee and come up with the refund rates as early as possible. Since we have discussed both these schemes, let us now try to solve two prelims based questions for the practice. If you look at the first practice question, the question is the WTO dispute panel has ruled India's export incentive scheme MEIS to be invalid. Such a ruling has been given based upon the violation of which of the WTO agreement? As I discussed, the answer to this particular question should be agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. If you look at the second practice question from this particular topic, with reference to the remission of duties and taxes on the export product scheme, consider the following statements. The first statement is this scheme has replaced the merchandise export from India scheme, which as we discussed is correct. This scheme provides for the refund of embedded taxes and duties in the form of duty credit slips, which once again is correct. Accordingly, the right answer to this particular question should be C. That is both 1 and 2. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 8. The article is titled as Supreme Court Paves the Way for the Ad hoc Judges in the High Courts. This article shall be important mainly with respect to prelims under the subsection of Indian polity and governance. See, as far as this article is concerned, from the perspective of the prelims examination, one should be aware about the procedure for the appointment of the retired judges to the High Court. This has been provided under Article 224A of the Indian Constitution. So before discussing this particular article, let us first look into its background. So if you look at the number of cases pending across the different courts in India, presently it is as high as around 3.5 crore cases. Out of these 3.5 crore cases, 57 lakh cases are pending across the different high courts in India. And as you can see in this particular figure, in some of the high courts such as Patna, Calcutta, Rajasthan, etc., the vacancy of judges is much higher than 50%. For instance, if you look at the Patna High Court, in case of Patna High Court, the vacancy is as high as around 60% of the judges. Further, it has been said that the overall judges population ratio in case of India is quite lower in comparison to other countries. For example, in US, we have 100 judges per million population. In Canada, it is 50 judges per 1 million population. But unfortunately, in case of India, we have only 19 judges per 1 million of population. So all of these factors will in turn lead to higher pendency of cases as well as higher time required to dispose of the cases. Now, obviously, if you have to improve access to justice, one way of doing this is to fill up the vacancies through the regular appointment of judges. Apart from regular appointment of judges, we can also appoint the retired judges of the high courts to the high courts. This has been provided under Article 224A of the Indian Constitution. Under this particular article of the Indian Constitution, the Chief Justice of a particular High Court can request the retired judge of a high court to take over the role of a high court judge for a temporary period of time, which can be of say 2 to 3 years. However, before requesting the retired judge of a high court, the Chief Justice of High Court has to first and foremost take the prior consent of the President, and he must also take the prior consent of the person to be appointed as the High Court judge for a temporary period of time. Second criteria is the person so appointed, he should be a retired judge of High Court. More importantly, he can be a retired judge of any of the High Courts. Now, for example, let's say the Chief Justice of Karnataka wants to request a retired judge of High Court to take over the role of a High Court judge for a temporary period of time. In that case, the Chief Justice of High Court can either ask a retired judge of Karnataka High Court, or he can also ask a retired judge of any other High Court in India. So even the retired judges of other High Courts can, for a temporary period of time, become ad hoc judges in the High Court of Karnataka. As far as conditions of office is concerned, the conditions of office is usually determined by the President, where the President of India determines the allowances, salaries and perks to be enjoyed by the ad hoc judges. The ad hoc judges would have jurisdiction and powers which are almost similar to that of a regular High Court judge. But please do understand that the Article 224A explicitly states that the ad hoc judges shall not be deemed to be a High Court judge. Now, for example, a normal judge of a High Court can get promoted to a Supreme Court judge, but in this case, they would not be promoted simply because they are not deemed to be a judges of High Court. As far as this Article 224A is concerned, even though this particular article has been part of the Indian Constitution, this provision has been used very rarely in our Indian polity. For example, according to various media reports, this particular article was invoked only 3 times in the last 58 years. Now, what the Supreme Court has done is, Supreme Court has come up with a detailed guidelines with respect to appointment of the retired judges to the High Court. These guidelines have been issued by the Supreme Court in a case known as Lok Prahari versus Union of India case. First and foremost, in this particular case, the Supreme Court has ruled that appointment of retired judges should not be seen as a substitute to the regular appointment of judges. So this should be seen of one-off exercise, particularly to clear off the pending cases. Further, the Supreme Court has also laid down a number of trigger points as to when the Chief Justice of High Court can resort to the appointment of retired judges. For example, the number of vacancies in the High Court is more than 20% of the sanctioned strength. Secondly, if more than 10% of the pending cases are more than 5 years old. And secondly, if the average disposable time to dispose of the cases is quite higher. So there are certain trigger points. So when these trigger points are breached, then the Chief Justice of a High Court can request the retired judge of a High Court to take over the role of a High Court judge for a temporary period of time. See, as far as your prelims examination is concerned, you should basically make a note of Article 224A of the Indian Constitution. This is the first thing. Secondly, just like how we provide for the appointment of retired judges to the High Court, we also can provide for the appointment of retired judges to the Supreme Court. Now, both retired judges of the High Court as well as retired judges of the Supreme Court can take over the role of a Supreme Court judge for a temporary period of time. All other features are similar to the appointment of retired judges to the High Court. Now, for example, in case of appointment of retired judges to the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of India can request any retired judge to take over the role of a Supreme Court judge for a temporary period of time. But once again, he has to do it with the prior consent of the President as well as the prior consent of the person to be appointed. Everything else is almost similar. Apart from that, here is your practice question number 6. Please go through this particular question and respond in the comment section with the correct answer. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 8. The article is titled as India at 142nd rank on the Press Freedom Index. Now, this particular article becomes important for your upcoming prelims examination primarily because if you have a look at the previous year prelims questions, questions have been asked with respect to the global NGOs such as Doctors Without Borders and Amnesty International. Questions have also been asked with respect to important indices published by the international organizations as well as the internationally renowned NGOs. Accordingly, with respect to this particular article, you should basically understand as to what exactly is Press Freedom Index and who publishes them. There is no need for you to go into a lot of depth regarding the Press Freedom Index. So if you look at the Press Freedom Index, it is basically an index which is published by France-based NGO known as the Reporters Without Borders. It is considered to be the world's leading NGO which is dedicated to the promotion of freedom of information across the world. This index ranks 180 countries across the world based upon the level of freedom that is available to the journalists within the country. The report itself says that this index should not be seen as an indicator of the quality of journalism. This basically highlights as to what is the extent of freedom available to the journalist. And this freedom available to the journalist is in turn measured in terms of some of the parameters such as the extent of pluralism, media independence, media environment and censorship, legislative framework, transparency and quality of infrastructure that support production of news and information. As far as India's ranking is concerned, as you can see, India's ranking has consistently declined from 133rd rank in the year 2016 to 142 in the year 2020. So this is what you should know with respect to this particular article. The next article appears on page number 7 and is titled as A Fresh Push for the Green Hydrogen. In the Union Budget 21-22, the Finance Minister had announced the launch of the National Hydrogen Mission. Accordingly, this particular article here discusses various constraints and challenges with respect to the National Hydrogen Mission. Now, various aspects of hydrogen mission, including the constraints and challenges, have already been discussed by us in the Indian Express Explained section. The various aspects of the National Hydrogen Mission was discussed by Mangal sir in the Indian Express Explained section for the third week of February 2021. The link to this particular YouTube video has been provided in the description box below for your reference. So you can go through this particular video in order to understand this article which has appeared in today's The Hindu newspaper. With this, we have come to end of today's discussion. Now the answer to the question that was asked in yesterday's DNS is option A.